Hello and welcome to the Teacher in Classroom 21 podcast. I am your host, James Sims, and joining me in person in the studio today is Marta Soteras. Marta, welcome. First of all, how is my pronunciation of your name?
Yeah, it's good. It's good, thank you.
Would you like to give us a technically correct pronunciation?
Technically correct. Marta Soteras.
Okay, so that leads into an initial question, because one of the things I'd really like our guests to get to know about you, because you're going to both be a guest on this show and also a presenter and a host on this show at times as well. Your name leads us to an interesting point. I know already, and our audience will come to know that you you have been in this country an NQT, a teacher. Mm-hmm. You've decided to leave the classroom, and you now own and run a business in the education sector. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of things to have done as someone who was not brought up in this British education.
I have also been a translator and interpreter.
I know, but I was thinking about and mother and so on. I get it. But could you tell us just broadly, first of all, about your overall experience of education in the UK, what you've come to notice about it, and what, for your eye and for your taste as someone who was brought up in another country, you see as the key characteristics of the British system?
Wow. This is a really complex question where, we could have material here for a whole episode, I think. What you need to bear in mind, of course, my experience of the classroom back in Spain is not as a teacher, it's as a student. So, of course, I was a student in Barcelona during the during the 80s and 90s. Sorry, excuse me for a second. During the 80s and 90s, and then I finished my degree in 2002. So, of course, the view and the experiences I had at that point, of course, will necessarily be very different from the experiences I will have had as a teacher in the UK. I'm sure it would have been the same if after that I would have gone into teaching in Barcelona itself. So I think we need to bear this in mind. Other than that, the things that have stricken me, probably the biggest difference I found when I started doing the teacher training was the element of targets. This is probably the most what took me longer to get my head around, and even nowadays I would argue that I still don't quite fully comprehend the idea. But while I was studying, and as far as I know, it's still the case in Spain, people don't work towards target grade. You just work, of course, internally. If you don't really get maths, internally you will know that the chances of you getting what would be the equivalent of an A star or a 9 are very slim. But nobody is going to put down on paper, if you work really hard, I think you're going to get this, So getting around this idea that it's always felt like you're capping the students' potential, really. And I know that, some people would argue that this is not the case, but to me it still feels this way, that the capping together with the labelling.
Okay, that's a fascinating response. I think it's fair to say, first of all, I don't think you or I would sit here arguing that the Spanish education system, or the comparison I'm making, is an optimized comparison in Spain. There are deep issues, deep maladies in the education system in Spain.
And let's not forget, also the school experience I am talking about, it was, mainly, 1980s, 90s, in a convent school. Mm-hmm. Okay, so highly where the focus was entirely on academic performance rather than anything to do with the arts, anything to do with creative activity was really, and even with physical activity, was not valued whatsoever. All that mattered was people being academically. So it was not an ideal school system by any stretch of the imagination, but in this regard, I think that that I find a big difference regarding this.
So I want to pick up a detail of what you said there. You said that broadly speaking, you have found the use of target setting. I think you mean target grading and levels rather than, say, a target of complete this task, task-based targets. Yeah. So things like target grades, for example, you find them to be a process of capping the learner. Just broaden that out for us a little bit.
Well, I had felt since I encountered the idea of target grades, I always had this sort of idea, and what really shocked me, I would even say, I remember I think it was in my NQT year. I was a co-tutor of a year 10 group, and right at the beginning of the year they were given a paper with their target grades, and there was this student who had chosen to do it at GCSE. I can't remember what it was, but they had hardly started the course, and his target was a C. And I remember him looking at that and saying, "Miss, why is my target a C? So is that why have I got this target?" He really couldn't really understand why that was there on paper, and I really sympathized with him, because I thought, how can anyone? Well, I can't even say how can anyone make a judgment, because that grade there wasn't really down to a judgment. It was down to some algorithms being applied to this individual, not being seen as an individual, but just being seen as a data element. And I really I saw there that I don't know, I really don't quite get it. On the other hand, the other thing that I also that I do appreciate very much of the British system, which is something that I was mentioning earlier, the presence. Well, I mean, some people would argue that with the current changes from the new GCSEs, this is disappearing, but that's another issue. But in general, that things like creativity and creative arts and things like drama art and all that stuff, that I think it's reasonably well resourced. And again, I know there are lots of issues, and I know it's going the other way, but in general, that there are far greater experiences, I think, than possibly in other countries. So that would be a big positive of the system, even if changes are happening the other way, unfortunately.
I think that's a really interesting point. So for you, in a relative context, you would argue that, at least in the comparison to your experience of let's call it the Spanish system, you would say that at least until this point, breadth has been an advantage or a positive for the British system. So that it kind of leads me to a question, therefore, which is, why, in your opinion, then, is it would you consider it to be important for young people to have breadth in their education? Why not do it in that streamlined academic, focusing on core elements of skills that you wanted to? Yeah, that in your opinion is broader here in the UK.
Well, I think mainly because people are all different, and some people will excel at the classic academic subjects, and they will love to, I don't know, they will love their maths or their English or their foreign languages, and they will feel really good when they get really good grades and they understand these concepts. And then there will be other people who they don't excel with that and on the other hand, they really flourish when they are performing, or when they are making things, or when they are painting, or and there will be people who excel academically and also excel at drama. So it's in order to, I think, to develop as many aspects of the person as possible. I mean, again, if I go to my personal experience, with a very sort of academic schooling, I had no idea. I was I would consider myself to be not very good at art because I was never really taught properly. Drama, I've never really had we never did that. Music was really poor. So I really feel that there are lots of aspects of myself as a person that I haven't really developed. And yes, I could have tried and developed them as an adult, but I suppose in order to do that, you have to have a certain interest, and something inside you probably needs to say, oh, I fancy doing this. And I suppose, I don't know, I haven't. So sometimes I wonder, could I be any good at doing this, or could I be any good at doing that? But I haven't really had the chance to give it a go.
It's something, and I don't mean to pick up on a personal conversation you and I had recently, Marta, but one of the things you said to me recently, I don't remember the exact context, but you said to me something along the lines of, we were talking about gender and gender politics at the time, and it's a slightly different conversation, but you said to me that, correct me if I get your words wrong, I don't mean to misquote you, but you said something along the lines of, if I had been a boy but had my mind and my thinking, or you might have said it with, if there had been no inequality, gender inequality, I think I might have been an engineer. Just tell us a little bit about that. I mean, it goes into sort of gender education, gender politics a bit more, but what I just made me think of it. So what did you mean?
I mean, the context, if I remember it rightly, the context of the conversation was something on the lines of, I think you were making the point that that in a way opportunities were the same for men and women, and that, you know,
I think my wording would be theoretical opportunities.
Exactly, theoretical. Yeah. So yes, exactly. So that if you're a woman and want to study chemistry, you've got absolutely equal access than a man.
In theory, in terms of the structures that are in place.
Nobody is going to say to you, no, you can't do this because you're a woman, or, you know. And probably nobody will put any obstacles to you doing that if that's what you want to do. And I think my point was that I agreed that you know, at least in the UK and in many other countries, that is completely true. You've got no actual obstacles of people telling you not to do it, but that still, as a society, I think gender still plays an important role. And I think in a way we, because of the influence of society, I was saying, I had, you know, for example, in my case, I had sort of contemplated, I probably did, with it not being a conscious thing, but I probably didn't see myself as doing something like engineering or something that would have been seen as a more men's job, and not because anyone told me to, not because I thought I really can't do it, but I think in my head I didn't even contemplate it. It didn't even become an option. And I was saying, you know, I may have done this because, you know, I really enjoy making things, I enjoy building things, I enjoy my, you know, bit of DIY and carpentry and that sort of thing. And okay, the fact that I enjoy this doesn't mean that I need to be an engineer, but of course, at that time, and having a relatively, you know, sort of academic ambition, maybe that's the way I would have gone. And instead, of course, I also really enjoyed languages. So I ended up going down the foreign languages route and studying translation and that sort of thing. Where, of course, I went to the, you know, translation and interpreting sort of in our faculty. In my degree, I think, if I'm not very much mistaken, I think in my whole cohort that year must have been about 160 people, out of which maybe 10 were male. It was a massively female-dominated degree. So, you know, of course, nobody pushed me into this, but I suppose as a woman, you become socialized to think that is maybe the route I'm going to go.
The metaphor that was springing into my mind is that I think sometimes we think about equality and inequality as whether the door is open or whether the door is closed, or whether it's partly open or whether it's partly closed, or whether it's you know, got some weight behind it. But maybe what you're describing there is that there was no door. Not that there wasn't, there's no door anywhere, but in your perception of the world, there was no engineering door. It was not on the horizon. It was not a consideration, and that can only come from some kind of normalization process from what's around you. I suppose you could make an argument that somebody's just never thought about engineering as a possibility, but you would have thought that certain processes, studying science, studying mathematics, careers advice, guidance, being led to be shown the possibilities of breadth. Not that engineering is any better than A, B, C, or D, but just that that's a part of the world that is available to you. So I find that really interesting. But I want to pick up on something you said there. You said that you've clearly shown there, I think, that either societal norms and or combined with your relatively narrow academic education limited you in your options to do certain things with your future. And I think what you're saying is that a structural advantage of the British system of education has been that we have breadth across various things, but you've also intimated that that breadth appears to be narrowing. How do you see that? I mean, as someone who has worked as a teacher, who's trained as a teacher in the UK, has worked as a teacher, now works in the education private sector. I mean, how do you see that? I mean, is that something we should all be worried about? Is it a small factor? Is it we're going to lose breadth, but we're going to be fantastic at maths, English, and science? I mean, what do you see?
I think, I don't know. It's a difficult. I suppose if I had this, if I had the answer to this question, I might become education minister or something. It's really difficult. But I don't know. I think what is happening is a shame. I think on the one hand, I agree that I think change is needed to happen in terms of the quality, I don't know how to call it. Here is where my foreignness becomes a problem. The sort of maybe the quality and maybe the depth of knowledge in certain topics, in certain subjects. For example, as a modern languages teacher, one of the things that I and many like me found really shocking is that students would be able to get to year 11 and go beyond without knowing what a noun was, what an adjective was, what a verb was, what a subordinate clause was, and you would mention these words, and it's like you were talking Elfish. It was ridiculous. And of course, that from here, not that the learning of a foreign language has to be super grammatical, but there are things that you can only understand if you understand certain concepts, if you understand your language to a certain degree. I'm not saying everyone should be fantastic linguists, but just have the basic knowledge of certain underpinnings. So I think a change needed to happen so that these people, so that people have a good, a better grasp of their own language, but also that then they can go on and learn properly and develop properly other fields like foreign languages or linguistics, or I suppose to a point things like even computer coding, grammatical linguistic understanding also helps with that. And
it's not just sometimes we consider something like coding to be the deepest of the deep knowledge around computers. You don't have to go far into any kind of web applications, anything. Even if you're not coding, you have to have a basic understanding of grammatical structures, syntactical structure, syntactical structures in order to be able to give basic instruction commands and operations to a machine to interpret them. So I wouldn't even consider that to be coding. But what percentage of the world is going to publish online in the future? Going to be very high. Now, of course, we're going to have very smart systems. Google provides many of them, for example. But for me, those grammatical rules would be deeply beneficial. I think we could say, in the positive side, is if we look at, if I think about my children, for example, especially my younger daughter, I was an adult when I became aware of some of the concepts, even a noun.
Yeah, I mean
that you were just for a second that you were talking about. And my daughter now has a better grammatical understanding of the English language, and she had that better grammatical understanding than I had, or at least explicitly, probably by about the age of 7. Now that's quite shocking to me, and I have to reflect on myself for that. But as a British guy who developed in the education system through the 80s and 90s, we also have to look and say, I don't think the issue was with the breadth, but we may have had breadth, but the quality and the detail of what I think we developed was questionable in some cases. I can't speak for all, of course, but that to me would be quite a concerning example.
Yeah, but I think the case of of your daughter, I think that goes the second part. The second thing I intended to say is that in there I have seen that maybe that trend towards sort of raising the bar maybe has gone a little bit too far. We find we find year 6 students who are 10, 11 years old learning about sort of defining and non-defining relative clauses, which is fantastic on the one hand, but I don't know how, I know that some or many year 6 teachers are finding it problematic to teach the grammatical and linguistic concepts that are nowadays being asked. And of course that can also be a consequence of whether these teachers have received appropriate training or appropriate continuous development in order to be able to grasp those concepts themselves and to be really, really competent and really, really confident with their knowledge. And my fear would be that many of them haven't. I only say it from what I've seen in the past with things like, again, foreign languages being taught at primary school, where primary school teachers, non-language specialists, feel really, really uncomfortable with teaching those things, and eventually they try and avoid them. Of course, the same can't happen with those grammatical and linguistic concepts because they are part of the SAT, so they have to do it. But I don't know. I wonder whether they've tried to go too deep too quickly. I think it's gone really the other way. So I don't know. I mean, I think the jury's out, and we will see. My hope is that okay, well, if this raising the bar means that in a few years' time, those MFL lessons will be populated by students to whom you say, well, you've got here this adjective. Of course, the adjective would change the ending because it goes before a noun, and they would go, oh yes, of course, without any further explanation, and they will just take it all in the stride. And cases like this will be more and more popular, and everything will become less scary and less cryptic as a result. Then fantastic. I just hope that the result of this is not lots of students thinking, I'm rubbish at school, I don't like it because it's just too difficult and I don't know what they're talking about with these all these words that don't mean anything to me. So yeah, I suppose the jury's out.
Well, I think the jury is out. I mean, I think when I reflect on my own subject area, because the point I really wanted to make there was that you made the suggestion that perhaps it's the case that some teachers are undercooked or under-equipped to develop that level of depth in knowledge at certain stages.
But just let me be clear. I'm not
through training.
Exactly, and yeah. I'm not saying that I mean, a teacher who doesn't
speak Spanish, for example,
or who doesn't master that area that well, it doesn't mean that they're a bad teacher. I just mean this because, of course, things like the deep knowledge of grammar wasn't a requirement. They probably wouldn't have done it themselves at school. It wasn't a requirement until now, so it is normal that people would be a bit lost and not understand.
It's an infrastructural, not a personal issue, isn't it?
If you're going to be required to teach A, B, or C, the institution, the system needs to make sure that you are equipped to teach A, B, or C. They can't just say, right, here you go, and from now you have to do this, which I have the impression is what happens very often. You're just left to your own devices and just cope with it.
The deep end, as it were. Learn by doing, trial and error. I do think there's a lot of Skinnerisms in how teachers are expected to become great teachers. It's accidental, it's trial and error, it's solve the problem yourself. Okay, that would be a slightly different model, but yeah, I think that's really common. I also think, I was thinking about it in the context of teacher development, which is not just kind of we've got this challenge on this topic area. We've now got to teach XYZ. We've now got to teach subordinate clauses to 7-year-olds or whatever. But isn't it isn't arguably the case that once you get into the classroom as a teacher, the quality of the development that you get over a consistent basis over, what's the average teacher career, 30 to 35 years, well, it wouldn't be average career, but or extended career, the quality of that is really mediocre in a lot of context. And the thing for me that I always think we miss when we come to something like teacher training, and there are exceptions to this. I think in primary school there's probably good exceptions, but here's my commentary on teacher CPD. By design, we have a structure whereby you qualify, you go through your NQT year. Let's say you're in your second year of teaching. You're a QTS qualified teacher. You've passed your NQT, and let's say you're a teacher of history, just to pick a subject at random. That teacher at that point is very, very, very likely to teach on their own without the presence of another teacher, or without having the opportunity to observe another teacher for some percentage of their teaching, which is going to be, I would argue in a very conservative way, upwards of 85, probably upwards of 90, possibly upwards of 95% of the time. So if that teacher is going to learn and develop the tricks of the trade, the deep skill, the greater skill, the structures we have of segmenting classrooms into what they are now, approximately 20 to 30 young people, approximately one adult, along a corridor, box-shaped rectangular rooms, then the next one, sometimes door closed, sometimes doors opened. If we have that model in place, then something like teacher CPD and teacher development is inherently and structurally capped, and it's ultimately going to come down to luck of the draw in terms of what your school provides you in terms of training, self-motivation and autodidactism in terms of what you're willing to teach yourself or discover yourself, and finally CPD budgets, which even if they were healthy, which they're not as healthy as they used to be, you're still very often being sent to central London, Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, whatever, for a 250 quid training day or conference, which, let's be honest, very, very frequently is not high quality. So for me, those infrastructural issues lie at the heart of the fact that teachers generally start at whatever level they start at, and their progression of learning is quite shallow on the whole. And I want to repeat what you said before. I'm not blaming any teachers for that. No. I don't think I've ever met a lazy teacher, to be honest. Maybe one. But you know what I mean? It's very rare. I don't think I've ever met a lazy teacher, so I'm not having a go at people for their attitudes or efforts. I'm saying that within a context, within a climate, within an environment that structures things that way, we shouldn't be surprised if the outcome we have is teachers whose skill level develops very, very, very gradually across an entire system. Of course, I very much praise those people that develop themselves and push themselves and find things out for themselves.
And I think it's very telling the number of teachers who say that their best CPD is Twitter.
Wow.
Not Twitter in terms of I just look at what my mates are doing, but in terms of that's where I get most of my ideas, that's where I get most of what I read.
It's good, it's there.
Exactly, it is good. It's good that you have access to things that maybe you wouldn't have access, you wouldn't have had access to otherwise. But well, I think it is worrying that the place where you work, or the system for which you work is not capable of giving you the training and the continuous preparation that you feel that you do deserve and need ultimately. Because that's the thing. It's not just a right. It's also a need, because otherwise you're there face day in day out with students whose I don't know whose future. Well, to an extent, depend on you. When you could make some massive mistakes. It is a job. There's a lot of responsibility, really, and I think everyone deserves a chance to do it properly.
Yeah, and I think if you then combine with the absolute fact that teachers push themselves very, very hard, it makes that right and that need even stronger, because teachers are willing. And the other thing I'd like to point out to people, I'm sure people have had the same thought, we're not talking about some random industry here where its main body of professionals, broadly speaking, do not receive the development that they need. We are theoretically talking about the learning industry. So theoretically, the education system, in my opinion at least, should be the most streamlined model for developing learners. If it's not that, then I don't think we should call it an education system.
Mm-hmm.
So we should call it an accidental system or something. But in the education system, in the learning industry, we're making a commentary here that a lot of teachers feel underdone when they have the right to be trained and developed in the areas of right and need that they genuinely have. And that I find that concerning. And I want to say as well, we often celebrate the teacher who puts their head above the parapet and does something new and different. We often praise that exception to the rule. We often praise that person that breaks the mold and does something brilliant. But often those cases are in spite of, not because of, the system. Wouldn't it be better to produce something where those things happened systemically and endemically within a model and a structure which promoted those kinds of behaviours? And that, to me, is at the heart of a lot of the issues we have. And I do want to come back to that point. If we put one teacher in one classroom with one class of, say, 25 kids, we should not be surprised that that teacher then spends the vast majority of their career on their own, neither being witnessed nor witnessing any other. And in my opinion, we can change that today. But I want to move on to something else, Marta. So you're a teacher 5 years?
Yeah.
5 years. Okay, so you developed from being an NQT. You were a qualified teacher for 4 years plus your NQT year, and then you stepped out of teaching in that fifth year, the end of that fifth year. Why?
Well, a combination of factors, really. I at the time, I was the last year and a half, I was working part-time as a teacher while I was also working at the Everlearner developing the Spanish course. So it was becoming increasingly difficult to be able to do two jobs well and focus on two jobs. And I think at that point it became, not that it hadn't become obvious before, but the demands of the teaching profession and it just where you almost become, it's almost you have to be thinking, or at least that's the way I felt, that I when I wasn't at school, I was thinking of the school, and I was thinking I have to be there because I had A, B, C, and D to do, and I still had this pending, and juggling two things was just too much. And I think after 5 years of having that, I think I needed to take a sort of a step to one side, and sadly, because I was really sad, because I really enjoyed the classroom environment. But yeah, I decided to, develop, and probably also develop other skills, because the other element that I also found is that in the 5 years where I had been teaching, during the first year, of course, I developed a lot. I learned a lot, mostly out of necessity, of course, because as every teacher will know, often the NQT year is a bit of sink or swim. And but then after that, after that first year, or the first 2 years, if you also add to that the PGCE year, then the learning, the further you go into your teaching career, it seems that, of course, the learning becomes lesser and lesser. And I just needed that feeling of, I'm doing something different, I'm developing something, I'm doing something, I'm at times out of my comfort zone again, and doing that sort of thing.
Are you out of your comfort zone now?
I am, yes.
How so?
Things like speaking publicly, doing this, yes. I mean, although, you would think, well, actually, by teaching 200, 300 students throughout a week, that's also public speaking. Yes, it is, but I don't know, somehow it is a little bit different, and I suppose in a way you sort of put on an act. I think teachers, everyone is a little bit becomes a bit of an actor, and you develop this sort of persona which is not quite you. And maybe you're doing this where it's more about me, and it's maybe a little bit more introspective, is maybe a little bit more uncomfortable. And and I've had to also, learn a lot of things about, computers, and and think in different ways, which is a welcome experience, really.
I need to ask you about the broadcasting for seconds. I think it's an interesting feature for you. So, you broadcast as a teacher, no doubt, because you were in a classroom and you transmitted information from the front of that classroom. I'm sure, presentations, teaching, whatever. This week, for example, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you've been involved with up to 9 or 10 live and recorded online broadcasts.
Yep.
How do you find that?
Well, two of those were presenting, doing the broadcasts myself, and the others were controlling it. And I would say it's probably equally...
And 2 podcasts, of course. This one and the one on Wednesday.
Yes, and I would say they are equally nerve-wracking experiences for different reasons.
You mean the controlling and the presenting?
Yes, the controlling and the presenting. Yes, maybe doing this is maybe little bit less uncomfortable, probably because there's no camera, nobody can see me. It feels a little bit more relaxed. So, but yeah,
I have that influence on people.
I know you do. But yeah, being in front of a camera is always a bit nerve-wracking. It's I don't know, just having this thing of you have to be careful with what you say. You need to be talking. You need to be saying things. You need to be interesting. You need to be engaging at the same time. Just make sure you don't say something that could bother someone, or Also, again, going back to my foreignness, I've had the occasional slip of the tongue when in front of students, and I've said words which are, big words. And
what would be an example? Are you talking about swearing, or are you talking about things that are more like words they wouldn't know?
No, swears. No, yes, that all the time, words they wouldn't know. But I've taught a lot of English while teaching foreign languages, believe me. And miss, is that really an English word? Yes, it is. I've never heard it. Well, it is. But also things like, the classic giving out pieces of paper, which I've become to just call piece of paper. Because
peace also has there's a little problem. There is
of course. It's a minefield.
But don't be afraid. Which is the word that sometimes comes out wrong from you?
Words like sheet.
Why is it funny? It's
I don't know.
So silly.
But yeah, because again in Spanish or Catalan, my 2 languages, there is no difference between e and e. We haven't got 2 different sounds, so I really have to think hard on that. Also, I've had on one occasion I had a problem saying that I couldn't do something.
Oh, that's a bad one.
I know, but I luckily I managed to keep a complete straight face, pretend, play my foreignness card. I saw some students smirk, going like almost, almost in tears. But I just pretended I hadn't noticed, because I thought, I can't, if I played any other way, that's gonna go badly wrong. So there were no consequences from that, but things like that. So that's an added element of nervousness.
And tell me a little bit about I don't know. Yours is. We should be clear here. You're not an employee of the business. You're a director of the business. So, so in that sense, it's fair to. We do pay our employees, of course we do. But tell me about having what I guess a lot of people would perceive as having less job security, as having not a regular salary coming in every month, same amount or slightly more once every 12 months or whatever.
Or the promise. Well,
the promise of So how do you find that pressure?
Yeah, the pressure is there, but I think I'm not a very I'm not a very materialistic person. Ultimately I'm not interested in money. And my philosophy in life has always been, as long as we there's enough, and if this doesn't go well, we'll just find a way, So I think sometimes you just have to take risk if you believe that something is worth doing. I think the financial risk, so be it. It's not taking a health risk. You're not taking So I think it is there, and it's of course it is much more comfortable to think, I've got a job where, next month I'm going to be paid this much, and the following month the same, and the following month the same. But I think it's one of those things that you just have to do. Otherwise, you wouldn't do anything else than just stay where you are and just always do the same, really.
Yeah, I find it the same thing. It's something I'm completely accustomed to. I haven't had a salary now. When was my last paid teacher role? Would have been August 2015 or 2014. So I think it would be. I can't remember if it's 2014 or 2015. 2014. So I don't have any anxiety around that anymore. Zero. I know that there's a possibility that somewhere things didn't work out, that I'd have to rethink and have to do something different. But it would take a lot for me now. It would take quite a desperate situation for me now to go back into what I would call employment. It would need my entire reputation to be shattered. It would need me for it to be illegal for me to create a business. I think there's certain conditions where if you go bankrupt and things, I think there's certain limitations on you. I don't know exactly what they are, but it would need something like that for me to seriously consider going back to employment now and finding that as to being the most optimal way for me to move towards my future. Let's just call it a financial future. It's pretty unlikely. The only thing really for me is I miss the classroom. So that's where I would consider employment, because I would consider a 1 day, 2 day a week role when things were balanced enough. I mean, in one sense, you might think that will never ever happen. But that for me is where I would consider employment, where it was a complete choice on my part, and I would seek an employer where I had the least responsibility possible other than what happened inside my classroom. I wouldn't be interested in really anything else other than it's nice to have a bit of a social side at work, I suppose, but I wouldn't be interested in anything else. It's funny how your mind structures change, and how normality can appear to shift very dramatically but re-normalize quite quickly.
I would agree with you about the missing the classroom. I wouldn't say I don't miss the classroom, but I would say I think for me, in my case, there was quite a lot of stress associated to the classroom. Not the fact of being in the classroom itself, not the fact of teaching itself, because that was, in general, of course, you've always got the, that group and that group.
The Friday afternoon lesson.
Oh God. The year 9, towards the end of year 9, means we're not doing Spanish anymore next year. Do we really have to do this? Yes, you do. But it was the stress associated to the planning, the marking, the accountability, all the things surrounding that experience that made that experience almost at times something, it's almost like by the time you get to do that, by the time you get to do what you went into teaching for, you're so exhausted from doing all the other things around it, which of course of course many of them are necessary and have to, but it's I don't know, I think I'm still in a way mentally recovering from that. And I'm sure that soon enough I will get to a point where I will say, I now completely miss being in the classroom. I now want to go back to
that is an interesting point. I do think it's fair to say, and I don't think you're talking about sort of like mental health issues there when you describe it that way.
No.
But I think it is fair to say.
Although I have, at one point, I'm not embarrassed to say, at one point, I think it was during my. I think it wasn't my NQT year. I think it was the following year. I had 2 weeks where I had to take time off because I was I was diagnosed with anxiety, and I could not possibly physically. I think it was around January time. So I suppose by that time, I have the impression that it was like an accumulation, like a build up through the previous 2.5 years of being on the go constantly. I was also, during those 2 years, I was spending almost every living hour thinking and living for work. I would wake up for those 2 years. I would get up about 5 o'clock every morning, I would go to bed at whatever 10:30, 11, not really having stopped.
And working up until
working all the time. It was from that time that I slowed down a little bit. I wouldn't say I of course I still didn't have a life work balance right. I know, but up until that point, I completely overdid it. And what's worse, I overdid it, and I had that feeling of I'm really not very good at what I'm doing. That's
a horrible.
It balance. Is a horrible thing, and I don't think, I mean, someone might correct me, but I think I was an all right teacher, but it's that self judgment and that. Because I think in teaching there are always things you could be more things you could be doing, or you feel there are more things you could be doing, and that you could be doing everything better, and that you should be doing everything better. And I think that eventually it takes its toll.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I find, for me, it's interesting to hear, because for me it kind of has worked almost in reverse. When I was a teacher, I think I probably had far better work-life balance than I do now, for example. So as a teacher, I don't know, I guess I was a reasonably competent teacher, and I guess I was quite a confident teacher, and I was able to keep minimum in its planning into sort of a minimalistic box. I was quite adept at having core resources, core experiences, and developing a lesson through them in the moment. And that's not to say there were always structures in place, where there's presentations, worksheets, questions, whatever. There were all those things in place. But I think I got to a point where the decisions and the flow of a lesson were quite momentary. And my teaching was much better as a result of that. Now, I'm not saying everyone should be doing that or could be doing that. I think it's just a natural state of play when you've been in the classroom for a period of time. So therefore, my work-life balance was much better. Since I've been, I don't like the term, since I've been a business owner or an entrepreneur, or whatever term you want to use, I have felt an unbelievable a very, very intense ownership of my work, partly because it's public, partly because it's very visible, partly because I think who ultimately our customers are teachers very frequently, who I think are, as a profession, obviously are going to be quite judgmental towards teaching, which is completely normal.
Well, you're encouraged, isn't it? You're encouraged towards that criticism, whether of one's own work or other people's.
So, and the other thing is that when I commercialised my work at the end of 2015, I felt a very, very major pressure that I was charging schools to pay public money into me and my work. And I felt a very, very strong sense of, I felt it was very, very necessary that within that context I provided those people with the best service that was humanly possible. So that led me to work ridiculous hours, to never stop, to work every weekend, to not take days off, to not look after myself, to literally think only about work for probably a 2 or 3 year period. And I'm not endorsing that as a model for anyone else. It was just the reality of the time. It's much better now that I have a team around me, have people to share things with, have people to talk to and talk about it. Even in this context, it helps a great deal. But the feeling of ownership I have for errors we make, for screw-ups we make, is very, very strong. So that I find much harder these days. So I feel a real duty and responsibility to people we work with. And in the past, funnily enough, I mean, I tended to translate that into, I had to make myself available to every teacher constantly every day. I strategically do the opposite now. I try and ration people of me, so that things come to me when there's a reason for it to come to me. But that's had to be very deliberate. It hasn't come naturally to me. In fact, today I've been doing admin work that I shouldn't be doing because I want to help. Someone's having a little issue with something, and I want to solve it for them. And sometimes I just revert into that mentality, and I go into that groove. But it's something that I want to develop. The other thing that's been really important for me is that recently I've realised I don't really enjoy being a business owner. That's not to say I don't enjoy aspects of it. It means what I mean by it is it's not what I'm best at. What I'm best at is being a teacher. So within this job, what I want to do is, within this business structure, is I want to do much more content work and teaching, while other people do, if you like, the managery bit. Because I was never a great line manager. I was okay at some aspects, but it wasn't my strength. So, I might own this business which has got a decent turnover and income and all that kind of stuff and what have you, but it doesn't mean I have to be the person in the office on their own. Why can't I be the teacher on the production line in that sense? And that's what I want to do. So, and we've got good people around us who can take on those other things and are better at it than me. So for me, it makes perfect sense. So yeah. So there we go. So look, we've been going for 50 minutes. We said 15. So that went on a bit. So so we're going to thank everyone for listening. Marta, it's been really insightful. I've really enjoyed it, actually. It's been really nice to chat. It's nice. It's a nice way to speak. You and I see each other every day. But in this context, actually a good way of forcing a proper conversation between us. So it's actually really nice. So thank you to all the listeners. Tune in for all of our podcasts. We're going to be publishing at least once every week, sometimes twice, sometimes, what's that word? Thrice. Who knows? Maybe even more. I was going to go to 4, but I don't know what the word is. Thrice?
4 times.
4 times, okay. So we appreciate it. This is The Teacher in Classroom 21. Thank you very much and have a lovely day wherever you happen to be.